The thermometer outside the window of Mike Anderson's cabin read an incredible 40 degrees below zero, and the temperature was still dropping. In his 5 years of living isolated in the wild heart of Alaska, he had never witnessed such relentless cold. The approaching storm system was not just another winter challenge. It was a force of nature capable of making even the most resilient inhabitants of the region question their choices and the sanity of staying in such conditions. There, in the middle of the frozen vastness, where the nearest town was 4 hours away by car, his weathered log cabin, scarred by past storms, stood alone, like a bastion against the harsh landscape. The decision to leave behind his hectic life as a wildlife photographer in Seattle seemed further away with each passing day, but it was his choice, his home. That night, as the wind howled furiously through the towering pines, Mike felt a growing pressure. Something inside him knew that this storm would push him to his limits like never before. The February dawn began like all others, but with a strange weight. The familiar sound of wood cracking in the fireplace was comforting, but the warmth from the embers barely reached the corners of the room, and the house felt colder than usual. Through the ice-covered windows, he saw that snow had fallen overnight, blanketing everything with a thick, immaculate layer. As he looked at the horizon, the snowdrifts, already deep, seemed heavier, more menacing. At 45 years old, Mike had adapted to the harsh conditions of life in Alaska, but he knew that as the years passed, nature could become even more unforgiving. Every day began with the ritual of checking his weather radio, reviewing supplies, and making sure he was ready for whatever the storm would bring. Although simple, his cabin was equipped with everything he needed: preserved food, medical supplies, and emergency gear. The walls were lined with images of his adventures: solitary wolves, majestic moose, and bears roaming freely in their territory, all silent witnesses to the solitude he had chosen. That morning's weather report was especially alarming. The storm system approaching from the north promised record temperatures and winds strong enough to bring down trees. Mike knew, with the certainty of one who had lived through many winters, that this type of storm could trap him in his cabin for days, perhaps even weeks. One mistake, one planning failure could be fatal. As he prepared, the old saying from his father echoed in his mind: "Nature does not forgive carelessness, son." That phrase was more than just a lesson. It was a truth that kept him alive, day after day, in a world where every breath seemed a challenge to life itself. The afternoon brought the first wave of the storm. The snow fell in thick curtains, nearly erasing the horizon, and Mike felt the pressure mount. He added more wood to the fire and, as always, began preparations for the worst. He filled the containers with water, knowing that his pipes could freeze. Despite all the precautions taken, he was ready. But deep down, something inside him knew. This winter would bring more than he could imagine. Mike quickly moved more firewood inside and checked his emergency lanterns. Living alone in such a desolate and unforgiving setting had shaped Mike in ways he never imagined. The constant awareness of nature's power had made him more patient, more attentive to the smallest details around him. He had learned to decipher the subtle signs nature offered, like the stillness that precedes a storm, the sudden deep sound of air being compressed before a change in the weather. Now everything had meaning. Every breath of the earth seemed to whisper secrets. The birds fell silent before the storm, and the air pressure caused an almost imperceptible pop in his ears, something so subtle that only those who truly respected nature could notice. His satellite phone, the only link to the outside world, was charged and within reach, next to the emergency radio. The nearest forest ranger station was 50 miles away, and with weather like this, any help would take days to arrive. But Mike no longer feared this isolation. He had grown accustomed to finding comfort in the silence, strength in solitude. As night fell, The storm intensified. The wind found every gap in the cabin's walls, creating a whistling sound that was always terrifying, no matter how many times he heard it. Mike prepared a simple meal of canned soup and bread, saving the fresh supplies for what seemed to be a prolonged period of confinement. But what happened next would challenge everything he knew about surviving in nature. As the hours passed, the storm intensified, but Mike remained calm, familiar with the sounds of the night. However, just after midnight, something would break the stillness, something he could never have predicted. Through the roar of the wind, he heard a distant, guttural, deep sound, unmistakable. Even muffled by the storm, it was a sound that made the heart of any wildlife lover race. A bear. And it was very close to his cabin. In the middle of February, bears should have been in deep hibernation, protected by the harsh winter. The fact that he could hear a bear so active in such extreme conditions indicated that something was terribly wrong. Mike quickly grabbed his flashlight and approached the window, cautious, like an experienced hunter. The beam of light cut through the darkness and swirling snow, but visibility was still limited. The thermometer now read 45 degrees below zero, and the cutting wind made the cold unbearable. And then he saw them. 3 dark shapes moved slowly across the vast white expanse. In the middle of the storm, the silhouettes were nearly impossible to distinguish. But Mike knew exactly what they were. A mother bear and her 2 cubs were there, their heavy bodies moving with effort, awkwardly. Even from inside the cabin, he could see the struggle in each of their steps. The powerful matriarch, who would normally walk with the strength of an unbeatable predator, was now dragging her feet with difficulty. Her cubs, barely able to walk, huddled around her, desperate, shielding themselves from the fierce wind. Mike watched, his heart tightening, knowing that this scene was a clear sign that survival was at stake for all of them, even for the strongest animals. Years of observing wildlife had taught Mike to read animal behavior almost instinctively. He knew that what was before his eyes was not something normal, and his heart sank as he realized the desperation of the mother bear. No animal would expose its cubs to such conditions unless it was a matter of life or death. Something had disturbed their den, forcing them to abandon the safe shelter and face the deadly weather descending upon Alaska. The mother bear, normally a force of nature, was now approaching Mike's cabin, seeking shelter from the wind that cut like sharp knives. In the beam of Mike's flashlight, he saw the thick layer of ice forming in her fur. The cubs, small and weak, trembled violently. Their bodies had not yet adapted to the unimaginable cold of that night. The mother bear, always so strong, was now struggling to maintain her stability, her endurance visibly failing. Mike's heart raced as he saw the bears dangerously close to his porch. This was exactly the type of situation that any safety guide would warn about. Bears approaching human structures, especially when they have cubs. In these circumstances, the mother bear could become unpredictable, driven by desperation, willing to do anything to protect her cubs from the relentless cold. Through the window, Mike could now see the bears clearly. The cubs were smaller than they should have been, probably born late, in a warmer season. Their chances of survival were minimal, if not non-existent, if they remained exposed to the storm. The mother bear began scratching at the snow around the porch, trying to create an improvised shelter, but the relentless wind blew the snow away, dismantling any progress. Mike's thermometer was now completely frozen, unable to register the temperature that continued to drop, becoming a symbol of the immense power of nature that dominated everyone. The wind howled louder, and Mike watched, helpless, as the larger bear tried to protect her cubs with her body, but it was a losing battle. One of the cubs stumbled, falling deep into the snow, and the mother bear gently pushed it back to the others. But the cubs, visibly slower and uncoordinated, were succumbing. Time was running out. When the second cub fell, the time to lift it seemed to stretch on forever. The mother bear's attempts to help grew weaker, her own strength fading in the face of the relentless nature. She let out a low, desperate moan that cut through the wind and echoed in Mike's chest like a cry for help, a deep, anguished call that went beyond words. Mike found himself pressed against the window, his breath fogging the glass. He had photographed hundreds of bears in his career, documented their struggles for survival, but he had never witnessed something so agonizing. The cold was killing them, slowly, right in front of him, and he could do nothing. The bears were now practically huddled against his porch, their last attempt to find some sort of refuge. The cubs were so exhausted they could barely move. The eyes of the mother bear, which normally gleamed with determination, were now glazed, and Mike knew deep down that the cold had already begun to dominate even her massive body. The mother's tremors were becoming more spaced out, a clear sign that hypothermia was taking hold of her flesh and bones. It was a lost battle, but Mike couldn't look away. He knew he couldn't change the course of things, but at the same time, the desperation of those animals, struggling for life in front of his eyes, ignited something deep and uncontrollable within him. Mike's hand rested on the door handle, his body torn between relentless logic and an urgency he could no longer ignore. Everything he knew about survival in the wild, all the rules that had kept him alive for years, screamed for him to stay inside, away from the danger. But as he watched the family of bears slowly dying on his porch, another voice inside him began to grow, a voice that questioned, what is the true value of survival rules when you witness helpless, desperate creatures who need help? The bears were no longer moving. The cubs huddled against their mother, who had positioned herself between them and the wind, doing everything she could to protect them. It was then that her eyes met Mike's through the window, and in that moment, something passed through him like a sharp blade. There was no aggression in that gaze. There was no wild rage or instinctual fury. There was exhaustion. There was desperation. And finally, there was a resignation that cut Mike's heart in a way he could never have imagined. Time seemed to freeze, the world outside becoming an extension of the pain reflected in that mother's gaze. His hand remained on the handle, the temptation to open the door and step toward them weighing heavily on his shoulders. But every fiber of his being screamed for him to stay where he was, safe, inside the cabin, protected. He knew what bears were capable of. He had photographed them, documented their power, their ferocity. Even weakened, the mother bear could kill him with a single blow if she perceived him as a threat to her cubs. The wind shook the cabin with such force that it felt as though the entire structure might be ripped from the ground, and then, suddenly, the bears stopped trembling. The silence was more terrifying than any sound he had ever heard. The mother bear, who had once been one of the most powerful creatures in Alaska, was now tipping to the side, her breathing becoming shallower by the moment. Mike knew what this meant. The cubs were entering the final stages of freezing. They were dying slowly, their tiny bodies being consumed by the cold. The emergency radio crackled with an updated weather report. The storm, now fiercer than ever, would continue for at least another 12 hours. With conditions worsening by the minute, Mike knew the bears wouldn't survive the night. He felt a deep weight in his chest, each heartbeat a reminder that the decision was about to be made. Ice had already formed in thick crusts on the bears' fur, and their breaths were becoming slower, more fragile. Their time was running out. Mike's mind raced frantically, running through all the options he had, all the implications of his choices. His shed, attached to the cabin and originally built to house his photographic equipment, was insulated, separate from his house, with its own entrance. It was a perfect temporary shelter, but putting 3 frozen bears inside would be a task of mortal risk. If the mother bear panicked, she could destroy the cabin, and they would all freeze there, with the storm consuming them. And if she attacked, help would never arrive in time. Even if he survived the night, having 3 bears so close to his living space was a threat that Mike knew he could not underestimate. He looked at his camera, sitting on his desk, as if it were a reminder of everything he had believed before that night. For years, he had documented wildlife, certain that nature should follow its course without human intervention. He believed that his presence should not alter the natural balance, that the life and death of wildlife should happen without interference. But as he watched the cubs, their tiny forms nearly invisible beneath the snow, reality began to unravel. He was faced with a choice that challenged everything he knew about the relationship between humans and nature. He could feel the line between observer and participant growing thinner, and there was no turning back. The mother bear's eyes never left him. In all his years of wildlife photography, Mike had never seen anything like it. There was a rare intensity in her gaze, as if she knew, deep down and instinctively, that he represented her last chance of survival. Her usual caution with humans, something he knew so well, seemed to have been completely overcome by the desperation of a mother in her final struggle to save her cubs. Another sharp crack echoed through the night, the sound of a branch breaking under the weight of ice and snow. Mike jumped, the sound reverberating as an alert. But as he looked at the bears, he saw that they barely reacted. Their lethargy was becoming an overwhelming presence, as if life itself was draining from them. The mother bear tried to nuzzle one of the cubs, but her movements were growing more and more uncoordinated, her strength fading with each attempt. Mike felt the weight of the decision pressing against his chest, a weight that made it harder to breathe with each passing second. He pulled the heavy winter coat onto his shoulders. If he was going to do this, he needed to be ready to move quickly. He put on his thick gloves and grabbed several heavy blankets from his emergency stock. Each movement seemed amplified by the silence of the cabin, and his hands trembled as he checked his satellite phone one last time, knowing it would be little more than a formality if things went wrong. He knew. The decision he was about to make had irreversible consequences. Opening that door meant breaking all the rules he had spent his life following. It was the opposite of everything he had learned about safety in the wild, his rules, his experience, his instinct. But when he saw another trembling breath leave the body of the mother bear, he understood. Sometimes survival isn't about following the rules, it's about knowing when to abandon them to do what's right. He thought of his father's words, those words that had always stuck with him. Nature does not forgive carelessness. But in that moment, Mike wondered if it would really be carelessness to try to save a dying family. Would it be reckless to risk everything to prevent 3 magnificent creatures from succumbing to the relentless cold? The line between wisdom and folly seemed thinner than ever. The cubs were now motionless, practically frozen. Only the faint rise and fall of their chests indicated that they were still alive. Mike could see it, each trembling breath a fragile thread of hope. The mother bear's eyes were beginning to close, and her enormous body slowly sank into the snow, the weight of the cold and exhaustion overtaking her. She was losing the battle, not against nature, but against the life force that had sustained her for so long. In a few minutes it would be too late to do anything. Time was running out. Mike took a deep breath, feeling the heat of the decision in his throat. He could hesitate no more. He began his final preparations, turning on all the heating units he had, creating as much warmth as possible in the shed. He placed the blankets near the door, where he could reach them quickly. Now, his hands moved with confidence, his determination overshadowing the doubt that had consumed him moments before. Each movement had a clear purpose: to save those lives. The mother bear watched him through the window, her eyes fixed on him as he worked, as if she was waiting, as if she understood what he was about to do. There was a deep intelligence in those eyes, an understanding that transcended the natural barriers between humans and wild animals. In that moment, Mike didn't see a dangerous predator, but a mother, fragile and desperate, fighting against time and cold, every fiber of her being committed to protecting her young. The wind howled louder than ever, and the temperature continued its relentless descent. But Mike could no longer turn to fear. He knew what he was about to do wasn't just a survival choice, but a choice of humanity. Mike's clock read just after 2 in the morning, the darkest hour of the night, when the cold reached its brutal peak. Everything he knew about bears, about survival, about the proper protocols for dealing with wildlife encounters, was about to be tested in ways he had never imagined. His hand returned to the door handle, feeling the weight of the decision on his shoulders. Through the frosted glass, he could see the forms of the 3 bears, their bodies now even weaker, barely resisting under the snow that fell endlessly. He knew the next few moments would be the bravest of his life, or the last decision he would ever make. Mike's heart seemed to beat stronger as he took a deep breath, finally turning the handle. The door creaked open, cutting through the cold night like a blade. The wind howled, bringing with it a gust of snow and biting cold that made his face burn. He could see the bears now, just a few meters away, their weakened forms half buried in the snow mounds that had grown around them. Mike stepped forward slowly, each movement calculated, every gesture made not to provoke a reaction. He stepped onto the porch with silent determination. The mother bear blinked, noticing his presence, but she didn't move. Her exhaustion seemed to be overpowering her survival instincts. She lifted her head slightly, her nostrils flaring, trying to sense his presence, but even that movement seemed to demand the last bit of energy she still had. In a whisper, Mike began to speak, his voice soft and calm. "It's okay," he murmured, even though he knew the bears couldn't understand his words. But the tone, the intention, perhaps that was all she needed to hear. The mother bear now watched him with a more focused gaze, her eyes showing a clarity of perception Mike had never imagined in a wild creature. There was no aggression, only a strange acceptance, a wavering trust in something she couldn't understand but felt. The cubs, in contrast, were motionless, almost buried beneath a thick blanket of snow. Mike could barely see the faint movement of their bodies, their breaths almost imperceptible. Time was running out. Even with his protective clothing, he knew that every second outside the cabin could be fatal for him, let alone for those tiny, helpless beings. He no longer had time. He had to act now, or he would fail completely. With trembling hands, Mike opened the shed door. The heat that escaped inside created a brief mist in the freezing air, a breath of life that seemed to defy the death around them. The mother bear lifted her head higher, and she stayed there, still, breathing more intensely, sensing the warmth that was coming from the shed. Her movement was the biggest one Mike had witnessed in the last few minutes, and his heart raced, anxious, as he moved toward the bears. He was now so close that he could hear the mother bear's labored breathing. With the blanket in his hands, Mike approached cautiously. The mother bear's eyes never left him for a second. Every step he took was a silent dance between risk and hope. When he finally reached the cubs, he carefully draped one of the blankets over their small, weak bodies. For a moment that felt eternal, the mother bear became completely tense. Mike held his breath, feeling the weight of the moment. His life depended on her reaction, but to his surprise, the bear did not attack. Instead, she slowly, with effort, began to sniff the blanket covering her cubs. It was as if she understood the gesture, as if she knew deep down that he was there to help them, not to cause more pain. The scene was filled with a strength Mike had never imagined witnessing, the mother's struggle, her desperation, and the silent trust she offered, even as the cold consumed her. The line between man and animal in that moment faded away. The warmth of his action was more than just a blanket. It was a gesture of humanity, of compassion, in a world where both were on the brink of the abyss. Encouraged, Mike stretched another blanket closer to the shed door, creating a path of warmth. His fingers were starting to go numb, and he knew time was running out. He couldn't withstand the cold much longer, but everything depended on the next decision of the mother bear. Her breathing was heavy, but her eyes never left the creature in front of her. The mother bear tried to rise, her legs trembling with the effort. The cutting wind made the scene even more unbearable, but with strength, she tried to stand. The cubs remained still beneath the blanket, their breath almost invisible under the snow layer. Mike could barely endure the silence hanging in the air as the mother bear tried, in vain, to nudge one of the cubs. Nothing happened. The second cub remained just as motionless. A sound of anguish, a primal cry echoed from the mother's throat, cutting through the howling wind. It was the fear of a mother, a deep and desperate fear, the pain of not being able to save her cubs alone. The tension in the air seemed electric, and Mike felt his heart race. Now he knew there was no more time. He took a step back, his movement slow and calculated, keeping every gesture deliberate to not startle the mother bear. He approached the shed door, feeling the heat escaping, creating a fragile line of survival that separated him from death. He stood there, waiting, his heart thundering in his chest as the mother bear's eyes seemed to weigh on him. Every second felt like it was dragging, and the biting wind seemed to want to devour him. The mother bear, still trembling, gathered the last of her strength. Slowly, with a visible effort, she rose. For a moment that stretched like an eternity, she stood there, swaying, unstable, facing the fierce wind. Her eyes moved between her cubs and the open door, as if making a choice. It was the moment that would decide the survival of her family. With surprising calmness, she grabbed the blanket with her teeth, gently pulling it, as if she knew that this movement would be the beginning of their salvation. Mike watched in silence, his breath almost stopping, as the weakened mother bear began to drag her cubs toward the shed door. Each step was a battle against exhaustion and cold. The blanket helped them slide over the snow, but the effort was visible. Her powerful muscles trembled with each movement, her strength draining, but her maternal instinct drove her forward. The distance seemed short, but the struggle seemed endless. Mike barely dared to move, barely able to breathe as he watched the scene that seemed more like a battle against death than a walk toward survival. The wind seemed to want to knock him down, but the mother bear didn't give in. She refused to let go of the blanket, which carried her precious cargo, her cubs fighting for their lives. Finally, almost miraculously, she reached the door. She stopped there, her colossal form blocking the entrance. Steam rose from her frozen fur as the warm air from the shed touched her skin. But the most dangerous moment had arrived. If she panicked now, in the small enclosed space, there would be no chance of survival. Mike stood still, waiting for the decisive moment. The tension in the air was palpable, but the mother bear's fear was overcome by the need for her cubs, by the desperate strength of maternal instinct. With what little strength she had left, she pulled her cubs into the shed, over the threshold of the door, seeking the safety and warmth she so desperately needed. Mike watched in deep silence as the mother bear collapsed beside her cubs, wrapping her enormous body around them, protecting them with everything she had. The warmth began to flow back into their frozen bodies, and the air seemed warmer with each breath they took. The battle hadn't been won, but now there was a chance for survival. With great caution, Mike closed the shed door. His movements were slow and controlled, the fear of making a mistake stronger than ever. Through the small window of the door, he could see the bear family huddled in the small heated space. The mother bear was still watching him, her eyes fixed on him, but now there was a slight change, a tension that began to ease as the warmth gently took over their bodies. Silence filled the environment, and Mike finally allowed his breath to calm. He knew that at that moment he had done more than save a life. He had given those beings a chance at a future. In the hours that followed, Mike kept vigil in his cabin, watching carefully through the window that connected his living space to the shed where the bears were recovering. Outside, the storm reached its peak, shaking the walls of the cabin with indescribable fury. But inside the shed, something extraordinary was happening. The cubs were the first to show signs of life, the first to show that the warmth was starting to take effect. As their small bodies warmed, their movements became more noticeable. At first they were almost imperceptible, weak and hesitant, but gradually they grew stronger. The mother bear, despite her evident exhaustion, lovingly stroked each of her cubs, encouraging them to return to life with the same dedication a human would give to a child. She never took her eyes off the window where Mike watched, but now her eyes reflected something different. No longer just the desperate resignation he had seen earlier. Now, there was a shift, something that resembled trust, a glimpse of understanding that, perhaps, she had found her salvation there. At dawn, the cubs were awake, their curious gazes turning toward the new world around them. The natural curiosity of the young bears began to manifest again as they explored the space that sheltered them. Though still close to their mother, their movements began to grow more playful, as if the warmth and safety had returned their youth and energy. The mother bear, though still alert, seemed calmer. She was beginning to understand that this strange situation was their only chance of saving her family. The storm outside showed no signs of easing, but inside the shed there was a fragile, precious calm. Over the next 2 days, Mike kept his routine of careful vigilance, placing water and food near the shed door while the bears slept. The mother bear, cautious as always, initially hesitated to accept his offerings, but soon the need overcame the fear. She began to approach the food and water with a careful acceptance, always waiting until Mike stepped away before eating and drinking, maintaining a delicate balance between her needs and her wild instincts of preservation. Mike respected this dynamic, never intruding on their space more than necessary. On the morning of the 3rd day, the storm finally began to subside. The world outside, once obscured by snow and wind, was transformed into a crystalline, frozen landscape, but one that shone brightly. The temperature began to rise, and the sun broke through the clouds for the first time in days, bringing with it the promise of a new beginning, the promise of survival. Mike knew that the time to let the bears go had come. They needed to return to nature before they became too accustomed to human presence. And as if she knew this, the mother bear began to show signs of restlessness. Her natural instincts, that primal call for the freedom of the forest, were being renewed by the warmth and sunlight. She stood up, her large form now powerful again, a stark contrast to the desperate creature of 3 nights ago. The cubs, now fully recovered, were more active than ever, leaping and moving with renewed energy, exploring the space around them. With the same careful and respectful movements he had used during those early moments of aid, Mike opened the shed's outer door. The fresh air and sunlight flooded the space, bringing with it the promise of a new beginning, of freedom. The mother bear lifted her head, smelling the fresh air and the warmth of the sun. She stood up with the same majesty Mike had seen in his previous encounters with wild bears. The strength she exuded now was unmistakable, and the change in her behavior was clear. She was once again powerful, confident, ready to return to her territory. The cubs, now agile and healthy, followed their mother's lead, their small and quick bodies moving with youthful energy. When they reached the door, the mother bear stopped. She turned her head, her eyes fixed on Mike, who stood at a respectful distance, no longer intruding on her space. For a moment, that seemed to last an eternity, she watched him. There was no longer desperation in her gaze, only a silent calm and mutual respect. And then, with one last look at the man who had given her a chance to survive, she turned and, with her cubs by her side, disappeared into the vast whiteness of the forest, following the path that had always been hers. Mike stayed there watching, his heart filled with an indescribable feeling. He knew that this was not just nature's victory over the storm, but also the victory of a connection between beings, something that transcended the barriers between man and animal. And in that moment, he felt more human than ever. Their eyes met one last time, and in that moment Mike felt that he understood something profound about the connection between all living beings. The mother bear's gaze seemed to carry a silent understanding, a gratitude that transcended words and reached the depths of being. With surprising grace for such a large animal, she turned, leading her cubs through the snow. Mike watched them, their dark forms shrinking as they moved further away, slowly disappearing against the vastness of the white landscape. The cubs hopped through the snow with the carefree joy of the young, their near-death experience now forgotten as they followed the path of their youth. The mother bear followed them with slower steps, her imposing figure outlined against the rising sun, an image of power and serenity at the same time. She walked for a long while, leading them toward the forest, and before they disappeared among the trees, she stopped and looked back one last time. She stood there, motionless, her gaze firm and deep, as if aware that this moment would mark the end of one story and the beginning of another. Even from a distance, her presence was dominant, like a force of nature that could never be erased. Then, with a decisive movement, she turned and disappeared into the forest, her cubs following her, leaving only tracks in the snow as a testament to an extraordinary encounter. Mike remained at the window long after they had gone, immersed in thought. He reflected on everything he had experienced in the past few days. He knew he had broken all the rules of safety in the wild, risking his life for an instinct he could not fully explain. However, as he watched the sun rise over the landscape transformed by the storm, he felt something deep in his heart. He knew he would make the same choice again if faced with a similar decision. In the years that followed, Mike occasionally spotted bears from a distance and wondered if they were the same family he had helped that night. He never tried to approach them, nor take a photo. Some memories, he had learned, are best preserved in the heart rather than through the lens of a camera. The decision to open that door, in a moment of pure compassion, taught him a lesson he would never forget. Sometimes survival isn't just about staying alive. Sometimes it's about remembering our shared connection with all living beings, even in the most challenging circumstances. He knew that this encounter wasn't just a story of survival, but a story of humanity and empathy, something that would touch his soul forever. If you too have been moved by this incredible story of compassion and survival, don't miss more extraordinary encounters between humans and wildlife. Subscribe to our channel now by clicking the button below and join our growing community of nature enthusiasts. By activating notifications, you'll receive alerts about new stories filled with authentic and emotional moments that remind us of our shared bond with the natural world. Your subscription helps us continue sharing these remarkable stories and spreading the message of respect and care for wildlife. Join us on the journey to explore the most emotional moments between humans and wild animals. Click subscribe now and be part of this transformative journey.